So welcome back to our series where we are building this Employee Success Predictor. This series is brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jay Finger, Principal Consultant and Founder here at Prairie HR Solutions. And I'd like to pick up where we left off, and what we need to do to move on, obviously, is to create this HTML page. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, please go back and watch our previous video where we kind of outlined what this is, and then we built a matrix concerning our correlations for each one of those tabs. And what the idea is that we are going to use very, very basic machine learning concept to figure out the success of an employee based on a given task. So if you have a task and you're trying to find the right employee, then you should be able to go through and actually type in that employee's ID, the task, and then get the probability of success, as we have right here. So to do that, what we're going to need to do is actually do a little bit with our code here. We are going to need to essentially create an HTML file. So let's first come in here and rename this. Now this may be somewhat of a long video because I'd like to build the HTML piece and then also start populating the main code for our learning piece. So let's change this here to utilities, because that's really what this is. This is just all utilities here. So we'll just call this utilities. And then we're going to need to create another script file, and we'll call this one main. And then we're also going to need an HTML file, obviously. We'll make this a web app. And again, we're using Google Apps Script, which is not ideal, but we have the series on it. And we realize that a lot of organizations are utilizing Google now. That's why we chose to do Google Apps Script in the first place. But there will be a point, in fact, there will be a point very soon where the calculations that we're trying to run through Google Apps Script will be too much for it. We'll run into run times and we'll have to migrate it. But we don't want to turn this into a Python or dedicated machine learning series. So we're trying the function and prototype here in Google Sheets with AppScript, and then we'll migrate it onto more of a relational database once we get that overall career path set, because that's really what this is going to feed into, is a career pathing as well. So we'll get the prototype done and then we'll worry about that migration later. So let's call this HTML page. Let's just call it, well, you know what? Let's just call it page. We'll just be incredibly original and just call it page for now. Okay, so that's page. So now what we're going to need to do is use our do-get to write an HTML service to pull the data from this HTML page. And let's just give this HTML page, I don't know, let's give it a hello thing. We'll do the typical hello world. Why not? Anytime that you start learning code, this will typically be the first thing that you produce. It just always seems to be that way. So we'll just do it here too. Why not? So let's come over to our main and let's get rid of this my function thing. And what we're going to want to do is we want to render this. We want to essentially create an output, an HTML output from whatever this page is. And to do that, we are going to need to use this built-in function called doGet. And what this doGet is going to do, just put, we don't need any in there yet. What this doGet is going to do is simply return an HTML service. And that HTML service is going to create an HTML output from a file, and that file is called page. And that is all that is going to do. So now if we were to save this, and in order to get this to run, we have to deploy this as a web app. So let's come up here to deploy. We'll call this new deployment. And what we'll do is we need to select our type, and this is going to be a web app. And let's just call this test 1 as a version. And myself and only me has access to it because it's the test. And I don't want to run this in the production environment, that EXEC. I want it to be in the development, because as we change this, I want to be able to see those changes. So I can just click done and then come back up here and use this drop down deploy to look at test deployments. And what that will do is when we open this, it'll run it in this DEV. At the end of that URL, you should see DEV instead of EXEC. Okay, so good. So we have our hello world. Awesome. So now what we need to do is build that HTML framework. And we're going to use Bootstrap to do just that. Our PCM uses Bootstrap as our front-end toolkit, so we'll just keep it consistent. And what we're going to need to do is come over here to our Bootstrap page, go to our introduction, and we'll just use this template right in here to get us started. So let's just copy this, and we'll go back over to our code and our page here. And then what we're going to do is just copy over all this. Now it's not going to be Bootstrap Demo as the title. Let's just call this Employee. We'll call it PHR Employee Success Predictor. Okay, good. Oh, yeah, they're using Hello World too. Okay, we don't need that. We don't need that anymore. What we're going to need to do is actually grab some input items. First, let's create a container. And this isn't going to be an HTML tutorial or a basic JavaScript or Google Apps script. If you want any of that information, please go back to our earlier episodes, and we do a good job of explaining that, we feel. So this is going to be class container. Now this container is going to grab the CSS for the Bootstrap container. So that's why we're using their classes there. Okay, and what we're going to want to grab from our Bootstrap page is some inputs. So let's come down here and let's grab some input groups. It's going to be a form, but we're not actually going to be submitting it, so we can just grab the group here. And what it looks like we could use is, let's just use this one here. I mean, that looks fine. So we'll just grab this and put this in our container. Put a couple of them in here. No, we just need that one for now because the other's a drop-down box. So now we're going to look at this and say, okay, we need to do a little bit of changes. So this span would have, here, let's show you real quick. So this span here is this little thing. Interesting, Bootstrap must have changed it because this should be kind of doled out or whatnot, but that's all right. We can take care of that with CSS. So Bootstrap has the span here and then our username. So we want to change this. We don't want it to be username at. We want it to be employee ID. And basic add-on needs to stay there because it's gonna, those are for the labels, but the label needs to be employee ID. And placeholder should also be employee ID. Form control is Bootstrap. We don't want it to be text. We would like it to be a number. And then it's going to be described by this. So you can think of this, if you know anything about HTML, you can think of this span as kind of a label. It's just different. Similar, but different. So now before we go on with this, let's actually wrap this in a row div because we're going to add more onto it. Okay, like that. And then let's give it also a column. Just do the closing tag since I'm already here. And then inside this, let's also wrap it in another div that will be the column. Column, and we'll give that column a 4. Because that way we have the other room for the drop-down box for the task as well as the button. Okay, cool. So we have that. So now what we need to do is create the drop-down box that we have up here, which is this select task. So let's run over to our Bootstrap and see what we got here for that. Might just be able to use our same input group and find one that works. That looks like, yeah, that's just a button. Don't want that. This will work. So let's just grab this here. And now what we're going to do is let's wrap this in another div. That's a column. That, but then we're going to need to close the column out here as well. Okay, good. And then we can post this right there. So this is going to be select task, and this task A will be the value. Task you will use underscores instead of spaces. Task, and then we'll create one for C. The label option here, that text content is going to be this. Task C. So maybe what we should do, well, we'll just leave it selected now for that. That'll be fine. So it's not this select, we don't want to use this input group select 01 thing. We don't want that. Let's just call this task selection. And this task selection will be the values of all this. Another task A, task B, task C. Okay, so let's save this and see what we got. Okay, so we have the number. We have that. Okay, good. So now we just need a button. So let's come over here to our Bootstrap and see what we got for buttons. Okay, so we can just grab this button here. That'll be fine. Grab this one. We'll come back over. And what we're also going to do is put this also in a column. So we're going to need this and this. And we'll just call this get probability. Okay, so let's see how that layout looks real quick, and then maybe want to do a header up here, and then, that looks fine. That looks all right. Like I said, I want to do a header, get this from the top here. So let's do some CSS and some styling. Let's put a header in there real quick, and then we'll move on to the actual functioning pieces of it. So this container, let's go ahead and give it a margin top of, let's do 3, and then a margin bottom of 3. And then let's add in a header, and we'll do that as a H1. We'll call this Employee Success Predictor. And then we'll do a horizontal row there. That'll be fine. Now this horizontal success predictor, when we save this and then go back, it's not going to be centered. Let's see how that spacing looks though, but it's not going to be centered. You see it's way over here. The spacing looks good. Spacing looks fine here, but it's not centered. So what we need to do is center that real quick. And how we can center that is by taking this H1 and then using the bootstrap class of text center, and then that'll take care of that. That'll move it over. So now let's actually come up here and do some styling. Now we have, so in order to style this, we want to style this span to a different color other than, just the same color as this input type. So we want to take all the spans and the labels, which share this input class. So this should actually, now that I'm looking at this here should be this as well, because it's a label. So this class, we're going to need to grab, because that will change both the span and the label here. And then we're also going to need this form control and maybe this form select. So let's come up here to our head and our header here, our head section, and then let's create some style tags. Just do it right underneath here, and we'll just do some quick little styling to make it somewhat stand out here. And the first thing that we should probably do is grab that container, and since that container is a class, we can use the point, and let's also select that horizontal line as well. And what we're going to want to do with that is kind of change the border color. And the border color, and look at my little wheel here. So the border color would look nice. I'm going to use our Prairie HR branding here. 1.9, so that'll be the border, and then we'll do the background. We'll make the background just straight gray here as DDD. And then we also need, so we got the border color, we got the background, and now let's do the border style. Border style, and that's solid. Okay, so we got the container. Now let's grab this input group text and our button. So this input group is this span, and then we also want to make this button the same exact color, so to speak. So remember, we were needed to select those classes, which the first class was input group text, and then also our button class. And what we're going to want to do with those is let's change our background color to, let's use this one to match our PCM, since that's where it's going to go. Now this is going to be important, and the reason why we're putting it important here is because Bootstrap already has CSS for these two classes right here, the button secondary, button primary, as well as this input group text. So we want to override that. We just want to override what they have there, and we'll probably need to change the text color as well to white. And then let me do some more CSS styling. You don't have to watch me do this. So I'm going to pause this and then create the other one so I can get the shadow. But let me show you what we have here so far. Okay, so we have our box. It's gray. We have the border. And you notice that it's this kind of grayish bluish color that matches that PCM if you watch those other ones that we have, and that's what this is. So now what we want to do is I want to change these a little bit. So let me go ahead and do that real quick, and then we'll continue on. Okay, so what I did here was I took our form select, and our form select is shared here for our select box, and then we also need to do the same exact thing with our form control. So what we're wanting to do is change the focus, because you notice the focus was that kind of light off bluish color that kind of transitioned the farther out you go. So what we wanted to do was to take that, and every time it was focused on it, we wanted to change the border color. And then we wanted to do the shadow with our transparency of this and this, and then we wanted to change that border color blue on the form select and the form control to match our 3C. So now when we save this and we come back over here, it should look different. As you can see, now it's more of that earth tone brown color that we have that matches this. Okay, good. So now we have this. So now what we need to do is we need to connect this button particularly with our JavaScript and our Google Apps script. So to do that, we can simply have this button call a function. So let's come down here to our button right here, and let's give it an on-click piece, on-click, and we'll have that call, let's just have it call a function called fetch employee prediction. So now let's create that. So we can come down here to our, below our Bootstrap bundle script, and create another script tag, and we're eventually going to move this into its own file. So it doesn't really matter the layout here yet, because we're going to put it over here in a file by itself. And now this is all JavaScript, and this is what we call the client side. We want all of our calculations to happen on our Google Apps script side or our server side, which is where our data is. All those correlations that we're trying to run from that sheet, we want all that to happen outside of view of the user. So in order to do that, we need to connect essentially a bridge and call a Google Apps script function here inside our JavaScript. So let's first create this function called fetch employee prediction. Now that employee prediction isn't going to take any arguments because it doesn't have anything right now. But what we're going to need to do is get the value of this and the value of this. So let's create a couple variables here. Let's call one variable employee ID, and that is going to be equal to document get element by ID. And that is going to be that employee, is it employee ID, which we don't actually have. Okay, so it's going to be employee ID. So let's make sure it is employee ID. And we want to give this input type right here the ID of employee ID. Okay, good. That takes care of that. And make sure this select here, task selection. And we want to get the value of that. And then we want to do the same exact thing for that drop-down box. And let's just call this selected task. That's also going to be equal to document.get element by ID, except this time it's going to be task selection right here. I can spell it correctly. And we also want to get the value of that. Okay, good. So now what we want to do with that is we want to send both these variables over to our Google Apps Script side to run a function. Send both variables to Google Apps Script to run. And how we're going to do that is by using this Google script run, and we want to receive data back. So we're going to need to use this, make sure I spell it correctly, handler. There we go, that looks right. And then we're also going to want to call a function over on our Google Apps Script side. Let's just call that function get employee prediction, and we are going to pass the employee ID. Now remember, employee ID doesn't matter which one of these is first, but when we access it, the order within here, within these argument, it matters. So just keep that in mind. Selected task is what we're also going to send. Now what we're going to want to do here inside our success handler, we could write a lot of code in order to handle this. We could create yet another code to push this, or what we could do is just write a function inside this success handler. You can either call a function or just run a function, and I think that's what we're going to do. We're just going to run a function here. And what this function is going to do, well, I'll actually do this two ways. I'll do it this way first, just so I don't confuse you, and then we'll consolidate this. Pop prob. That's what we'll do. We'll just call it that. So now, if you watch the previous videos, we would need to create this function, this pop prob function. And there's going to be some data coming back to this. Obviously, it's going to be the probability. So we'll just call this probability. And what this function is going to need to do is grab this probability and place it in something. Now, we don't have a place to put it. So let's just create ourselves a little p tag, a little paragraph tag, and we'll put that right underneath this row here. So let's just place it here. And what we'll call this, we'll just call this result for now. And it's going to be empty because we're going to populate it. Okay, good. So now we can grab this result p tag, and we can set the inner text to whatever that probability is. So let's set the inner text to, let's say something along the lines of predicted probability of success is going to equal, or is going to be whatever, and we need to add this probability right here, whatever value that is. Okay, good. So now we can run this and it would work, but I want to show you a little bit of condensing of what it is that we can do. So we don't actually need to call a function here. We can run that function within our piece here. So what we can essentially do is grab this. We don't need to call a function name, but we can just put it right in there like so. And then we don't actually need to call a different function. And it's going to work the same exact way. That way we're just running it right off the bat without having to call it. Okay, so good. So this works if you're only having one function do one thing, which is what we're doing. Okay, good, good, good. So now what we need to do is go over to our Google Apps script side and create this get employee prediction. So let's come over here to our main and we'll create that function. Let's do it right underneath our do get. And remember, it's going to take two pieces of arguments, or two arguments. And those arguments were the employee ID, and the selected task. Now, these are going to stay the same. If you watched that previous video, we were taking the data in the row and the data in the column. So that data, we were calling it multiple times. So that data wasn't necessarily the same. So we didn't want to reference it the same, but for here, this employee ID and the selected task will always be a value assigned with this variable. So we can just use the same terminology here. So this will be the first employee ID, and this next one is going to be selected task. Okay, so now we need to create a variable, and we've done this in our utilities, and this will be, good for cleanup. Because if you do it more than once, chances are you can consolidate it. But for now, let's just kind of do a little bit of duplication effort to keep it simple. Call this variable sheet, and this is going to be our spreadsheet app, and we want to get the active spreadsheet just like we did last time. And we want to get the sheet by name. Now we need to find out the name. We could use this data sheet, but I want to be a little bit more robust with it. So let's create a different one. We'll call this employee data. So let's add a sheet here. We'll rename it. We'll call this employee data. And let me just grab some data here. And then as we're building the model, probably in the next episode, this will start making sense, but I'll go through it a little bit here. So we have our employee data created. Instead of using this one, we can incorporate this, but this one was really to demonstrate the correlation matrix and what's happening kind of in the back end, that virtual piece of it. But this data is the one that we're actually going to use. We're going to grab this data here and actually run our correlation off of it. What we have is our employee ID, current years in the current role, at the company, our performance scores. But the one thing that we added here was our technical competency 1s, 2s, and 3s, and then behavioral competency 1 and 2. Because what we're doing is we want to give it more data to actually run a better analysis on. Because our data piece here was just, chances are you would not be looking at this and making a decision because you just need more data. You need, what happened at this instance? Are there any performance improvement plans? What are the outcomes of those performance improvement plans? So you want all the performance data that you can possibly get. And that's what we were starting to build on here in our employee data. So we're going to use this, and we call this employee data. So let's go back here and call employee data like that. And that's what we want to get. We want to store that in our sheet. And then we want some data. So let's create a data variable. And this data variable is going to be equal to that sheet. And this time, let's just use our get data range. I know we didn't use it before. I was trying to illustrate different ways that we can get data. But in this case, let's just get our data range, which will pick up everything because it is rectangular. We don't have one column with more or less. So for this, we can just use get data range, and we want to get the values of that data range. And let's also grab our headers as well, because we're going to use our headers to sort of map our data. Now the headers, if you remember, let me go back here and let's log this out and I'll show you what it looks like. So let's save this and then we'll run this get employee prediction. So you'll see that it's a two-dimensional array because we're using get values, and the inner array at index 0 is our header. And we're going to use this header to kind of map through this and create objects. So we can create a variable. Let's call that variable, let's just call it headers like we did last time, and that is going to be equal to data at 0 index. So now we need to take our employee ID and find wherever in this data set that employee ID exists. So we could use an index of, but instead I think we'll just do a for loop and then build a object. Yeah, that's what we'll do. We're just going to build an object with that data. So we'll find the row where the employee ID lives. So let's create a for loop. No, actually, let's not create a for loop first. Let's create a empty array to put the data in. It's not an array, excuse me, it's an object because that's what it's going to need to be. Now we can create that for loop and start filling this employee data object. So let's create our I, and our I is going to be equal to 1 because there's no 0. There's no 0 employee, it's 1.0. Semicolon, and we want to run it for however long our data length is. This gives us the ability to expand, and then we want to increment that upwards, so I++. Now what we're going to need to do is run a logical condition or a logical if statement, and then depending on the outcome of that, we're going to need to run another for loop. So it's going to be a for if for loop. So what we're going to need to check with our if statement here is inside this employee data, if this cell, which would be our data at the 0 index, equals employee ID, then we want to run something because we're checking for this. We got to grab this. And then if it doesn't equal employee ID, if it equals one of these, then we just don't want it to do anything. So how we can write that is if our data at I index 0 is strictly equal to, oh, well, let's not make it strictly equal to, let's just make it 2 equals employee ID, and it has to be exactly the same. That's one thing that if you're using your headers as anchor points, as I like to call them, they must be identical. So if you used an underscore here, it's got to be an underscore. And if it is, then what we want to do is we want to run our true for if statement. And if not, then we just want to end it. We just want to stop. So what we want to do is take our employee data, this little empty object here, But first, actually, hold on a second. Let me think of the operations here. So we have our for loop, and within that for loop, we want to check every single time if that cell is equal to our employee ID. And if it is, then we want to loop it again. So this is where our second loop will come in. And let's just call this HIJ. Let's just call it J. Is going to be starting at 0, and J is going to be equal to the header's length. And we're going to want to increase that incrementally. And then we want to take our employee data and start filling it with things. And what we're wanting to fill it with is the header J, because we need those titles. And we want to set that equal to the data for I at J, two-dimensional array. Okay, so then this closes out that loop. And if it doesn't, then we need to break. And then that should close out the if, and then that should close out the other loop. Okay, so good. So we created something a little bit more condensed than what we would have had to have done than just running a for loop and then writing an if statement off that and then doing a for loop based on that if statement. So this essentially just took multiple lines of code and shoved it into these four. Okay, so let's just make sure that we got these set right. Okay, typos are horrible when you do that. Okay, good. All right, so now what we need to do is figure out how to get our probability. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create, I know we're getting up in time and I'd like to keep this somewhat digestible into sections. So let's put ourselves here a comment, a to-do list, call a function that will return our probability, and then store that in a variable. Okay, good. So let's actually just save this, because right now it's not doing anything at all. But to check to see if this is actually working here, let's have it, because we still need to do the selected task. That selected task is going to be our probability piece. But let's just come back over here to our page and make sure that this piece here works. So it actually shouldn't. It should return nothing. So let's test it out here. Okay, predicted probability of success is null. Good. Okay, so at least it's calling things and returning things back. So that's good. So I'm going to end this video here, and what we'll do next time is we will then create that probability function and then return the percentages of that. And that one's going to take a little bit of coding, because we're going to need to essentially define the coefficients. And what I mean by that is assign weights to each one of those labels, as well as constricting ranges, and then do a little bit of calculations on things like weighted sums and intercepts and pieces like that. So that's what we'll do next time. So I hope this has been informative. Thank you guys so much for, hanging with me. And that next episode will be the last one. We should have our probability. So until then, please take care.